There are men who cheat not because of a lack of love, but because something within them remains restless, hungry, as if an invisible force were pushing them toward the abyss they fear most. Jungian psychology doesn't judge this movement, but observes it in depth. The impulse to cheat is not just an act, it's a symptom of a fragmented soul. Modern man, civilized and controlled, still carries within himself the primitive instinct that wants to feel alive, desired, powerful. And when life seems too domesticated, the unconscious begins to whisper, "There's something in you that you've forgotten to live." Betrayal, in this sense, doesn't begin in bed, but in the silence of the mind. It's the echo of the shadow, that which a man tries to hide from himself, but which observes him from within. Jung called everything we repress the shadow: desire, anger, vulnerability, the fear of being ordinary. This shadow, ignored for too long, gains strength and demands to be acknowledged, not to destroy, but to balance. The man who betrays, in truth, responds to an unconscious call, the call of his own shadow wanting to exist. He can deeply love a woman and still feel the urge to betray her. This confuses, frightens, and shames him. But what really happens is that he confuses love with control, fidelity with self-annihilation, and desire with sin. The shadow doesn't understand these rules. It is pure energy, and it seeks expression. When a man doesn't find healthy ways to experience it, through creativity, courage, vulnerability, it dominates him in another way. Betrayal becomes the portal through which he tries to breathe the air he lacks, even if that air is poisoned by guilt. Jung viewed man as a divided being. On one side, the ego, the social, moral, and rational mask, and on the other, the soul, deep, wild, instinctive. Infidelity arises when the ego tries to silence the soul for too long, and it is in this imbalance that desire gains a voice, becoming stronger than reason. The traitor, at this point, is not seeking another woman, but himself. He tries to rediscover the forgotten part of his own masculinity, the part that feels pleasure, intensity, and freedom. It is a blind search for something he lost when he began to become who others wanted him to be. At the same time, there is a paradox. The more he tries to fill the void with new experiences, the more that void expands, because what he seeks is not outside, it is within. He doesn't need new bodies, but reconciliation with his own unconscious. Pleasure becomes a distraction from self-knowledge, and guilt, the symbolic punishment for this escape. It is a cycle of pleasure and punishment that reveals the internal struggle between man and his own soul. Jung's figure looms over this understanding as a compassionate, almost silent observer. He doesn't point the finger, he doesn't accuse, but reveals. The man who betrays is not a villain, he is a being in search of wholeness. This phrase synthesizes the heart of this first journey. Betrayal, in the Jungian view, is a mirror of the conflict between instinct and conscience. When man denies his instinctive nature, it invades him destructively. But when he embraces it, he can transform the impulse into creative energy. Thus, the desire that dragged him towards the abyss can become the force that elevates him to consciousness. Betrayal, therefore, is a symptom, not of a lack of love, but of a lack of integration. Modern man has learned to repress his instincts, but not to understand them. He lives fragmented, divided between what he feels and what he believes he should feel. And as long as this division exists, the impulse to betray will only be a disguise for a deeper desire, to feel whole again. Because what he really seeks is not another woman. It is a version of himself that he believes he has lost. And it is here that the first portal opens, the one that separates the ordinary man from the conscious man, the one who has the courage to look inside and admit that infidelity is merely a mirror, reflecting what he has long refused to see. The hook extends silently, inviting him to descend deeper. If what he betrays is not his partner, but his own soul, what will happen when he finally confronts the shadow that guides him? There comes a moment when a man, even surrounded by everything he has built, family, respect, comfort, feels a disconcerting emptiness. It is not the emptiness of loneliness, but that of a soul that has lost touch with its own spark. He looks in the mirror and realizes there is another gaze within his own, something dormant, restless, silently observing him. It is the shadow, once again. Only now, it does not manifest as an impulse, but as an absence, an invisible hole between what he shows and what he truly feels. Jung called this disintegration, when a man lives only for the persona, the social mask, and forgets who he truly is. The shadow cannot be ignored for long. It begins to seep into the small cracks of routine. A lingering glance at someone at work, a light conversation that seems harmless, but awakens a long-forgotten gleam. Desire, which previously slept under the weight of morality, awakens like a whisper. Do you remember me? It's not about lust, but about recognition. That feeling of being seen, admired, desired. For many men, this moment of attention becomes addictive. It's a reflection of what Jung called soul hunger, the need to feel alive through the gaze of another. It is at this point that betrayal begins to take shape, not as an act, but as an internal narrative. The man begins to create justifications. He tells himself that he is tired, that he has lost something in the relationship, that he deserves some pleasure. But behind these words lies a deeper conflict, the power complex. Jung described this complex as one of the ego's traps, the unconscious attempt to reaffirm one's own virility when the outside world no longer nourishes it. Infidelity, then, becomes a symbolic ritual, a way of proving to oneself that one can still conquer, dominate, be chosen. But this search is illusory. The pleasure that comes is intense, almost mystical, and soon disappears. The man feels a force that lifts him up and then throws him back to the ground. And, in this abyss between the peak and the guilt, he experiences the truth he fears most, that he did not betray out of desire, but out of weakness. The body was merely the vehicle. The true act took place within the mind, where he tried to regain the power he had lost over himself. In many accounts from men who cheat, a phrase is repeated with different nuances. I just wanted to feel important again. This confession reveals something essential. The cheater is not seeking physical pleasure, he is seeking validation. He wants to prove to himself that he is still seen, that he still arouses interest, that his presence still has an impact. Infidelity is, therefore, a psychological mirror, reflecting not the desire for another person, but the need to rediscover self-worth. Jung would say it is the shadow of narcissism projecting itself onto the world, the man trying to heal his self-image wound with the gaze of another. The mystery is that the more he engages in this attempt to fill the void, the further he distances himself from himself. He believes he is gaining control, but in reality, he is controlled by something deeper. His inflated ego becomes a hostage to its own lack, and the paradox repeats itself. The man seeks to be admired to feel whole, but each achievement fragments him even more. The shadow guides him patiently, like a silent master who teaches through pain. Jung saw this as an inevitable process of confrontation. The shadow, when ignored, manifests itself destructively, but when faced, it reveals wisdom. The man who allows himself to observe his own impulse without yielding to it takes the first step towards awareness. There is no glory in this, there is humility. Because true power lies not in conquering the other, but in recognizing one's own emptiness without trying to fill it with illusions. Still, few reach that point without falling first. The shadow demands sacrifice. It forces man to shed his masks, to look at the face behind the persona. And that look often hurts more than any loss. But it is in that instant of ruin and lucidity that the possibility of redemption begins. When he realizes that the power he sought outside is, in fact, the same power he abandoned within himself. And it is then that the cycle prepares for the next movement, the direct confrontation between man and the force that inhabits him. Because the shadow, now awakened, is no longer content to remain invisible. There are times when a man believes he is in control of his actions, but what he doesn't realize is that often it is impulse that drives his most intimate decisions. Jung called this psychic possession, when the unconscious takes command and the ego merely obeys, believing itself to be the author. In this state, a man betrays, lies, contradicts himself, and then tries to rationalize what he has done. But deep down, he feels that something deeper is happening. He doesn't understand why he takes risks, why he challenges the balance he himself has built. The answer, though painful, is simple. He has been overtaken by the force of a power complex. The desire is no longer merely sexual. it is existential. He wants to feel invincible. He wants to be the god of his own destiny. And in this illusion, the ego is lost. This complex stems from the wound that man carries from the moment he realized he is not limitless. In his youth, he believes he can conquer the world. With time, the world challenges him, and he perceives the limits of his own impotence. It is in this clash with reality that the power complex forms, an unconscious attempt to recover lost dominance. Betrayal becomes the theater where he plays this role of grandeur. Each conquest is a performance by his own ego, trying to prove that he still has power over something. But the more he tries, the further he gets from true strength. Because real power is not proven, it is recognized. Does he truly seek pleasure, or does he merely want to escape the feeling of being insignificant? The question haunts him silently, because the man who betrays out of a need for self-affirmation no longer acts out of desire, but out of fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being ordinary, fear of no longer being admired. Infidelity becomes a bitter remedy against the anxiety of disappearing. And the more he seeks affirmation in the gaze of others, the more dependent he becomes on this invisible drug called validation. The paradox is cruel. The man who wants to feel free is the most imprisoned of all. There is something tragic in this process. He convinces himself that he is in control, but the true commander is the unconscious. That vast ocean of desires, memories, and symbols that moves him like a silent tide. He can plan, promise, rationalize, but deep down, he is dragged along by a current he doesn't understand. Jung said that man's consciousness is like a small island in the middle of an infinite sea. When the tide rises, the island floods, and the ego dissolves. This is what happens when the power complex takes over. Man ceases to choose and becomes chosen by his own drives. How many times has he wondered why he can't stop? Why, even when repentant, does he repeat the same routine? The answer lies not in morality, but in the psyche. The impulse to betray is not rational, it's archetypal. It comes from something older than civilization, a legacy of the struggle between instinct and spirit. Deep down, it enacts the battle between the man who wants to control and the man who wants to surrender. This tension creates a state of fascination and despair, a cycle in which pleasure and guilt alternate like waves. The ego tries to resist, but each resistance only reinforces the power of the unconscious. When Jung spoke about the need to integrate the shadow, he wasn't talking about eliminating the instinct, but about transforming it. The man who confronts his own darkness discovers that power lies not in dominating others, but in recognizing the forces that dwell within him. The energy that once led him to betrayal can become the same energy that leads him to creation, to courage, to depth. But for this, an act of surrender is necessary, looking inward and admitting that weakness is also part of strength. Because true power is not shouting, but remaining silent in the face of one's own chaos. Modern man fears this silence. He fills every void with noise, every doubt with distraction, every pain with pleasure. But the unconscious is patient. It waits. And when man tires of running, when pleasure no longer anesthetizes him, when the mirror reflects back a look he doesn't recognize, that's when the transformation begins. The power complex doesn't disappear, but reveals itself for what it always was, a plea for reconnection. The desire to feel whole, not invincible. What if the power he so desperately seeks is not something to conquer, but something that needs to be remembered? The question remains open, like a seed planted in the mind. Because perhaps man doesn't need to prove he has power, only awaken to the fact that he lost it when he began using it to escape himself. When a man looks at the woman beside him and feels a distance, what he truly sees is not her. It's the reflection of something he has lost within himself. Jung called this lost part the anima, the man's inner feminine, the bridge between his reason and his soul. When this bridge breaks, he becomes a stranger in his own emotional world. Sensitivity, empathy, tenderness, and silence cease to be allies and become signs of weakness. He dons the armor of virility and prides himself on being impenetrable. But the stronger he tries to appear, the more fragile he becomes. Because the human soul cannot survive where there is no contact with feeling. This disconnect explains why so many men, when cheating, seek not only pleasure, but also lost emotion. They look for the expression of their own anima, the denied feminine within them, in other women. It's as if they want to touch what they let die within themselves. It's not the other woman's body that fascinates them, but the sensation of being alive again. There is something profoundly symbolic in this movement. The man tries to rediscover, through the woman, his own emotional center. But this rediscovery, being unconscious, is never complete. He confuses intensity with love and ends up trapped in the illusion that the new will always be the remedy for the old emptiness. In one of the most intriguing studies in analytical psychology, Jung observed that the dreams of many unfaithful men featured mysterious female figures, muses, lovers, strangers, who seduce them and then vanish the next instant. He saw in this an exact portrait of the relationship between man and his anima. The more it is rejected in consciousness, the more seductive it becomes in the unconscious. The real woman is merely the mirror where this image is projected. The fascination with novelty, with the forbidden woman, with intense emotion, is not desire for another person, but longing for one's own lost femininity. And this longing, when not recognized, transforms into compulsion. But there is an even more disconcerting revelation. Many men who deny their anima are precisely those who pride themselves most on mastering their feelings. They believe that emotion is weakness, that vulnerability is danger, that love is for those who have lost control. They live as if feeling were the enemy of thinking, and therefore they fall into shallow, repetitive relationships that only reflect their own fear. In these cases, the woman becomes a mirror that challenges him to recognize the part of himself that he insists on keeping hidden. She fascinates and frightens him because she represents exactly what he most represses. There are real stories that clearly illustrate this paradox. A successful man, married for 20 years, described the betrayal as a dizzying experience. He said he felt alive, young, complete, and that for a time, he believed he had rediscovered love. When the affair ended, he plunged into an even deeper void. Upon starting therapy, he realized that he wasn't seeking the mistress, but the emotion he had buried within his marriage, the desire to be vulnerable, to allow himself to feel without fear. Adultery, in this sense, was a symptom of the soul trying to resurface. As Jung said, the psyche always finds a way to express itself, even if that way is destructive. Have you ever noticed how modern man fears silence? How he flees from everything that compels him to feel? This flight is what distances him from the anima. He seeks noise, movement, constant stimulation, because he fears the void where the unconscious speaks. Betrayal, then, is not only an act against the other, but against the self, the denial of internal dialogue. And the more he distances himself from feeling, the more the shadow dominates him. The woman becomes a symbol of what he has lost, and the desire for her, a plea for reconciliation. True transformation begins when a man has the courage to listen to what his soul tries to say through desire. When he understands that strength lies not in resisting emotion, but in integrating it. Jung believed that a man only becomes whole when he accepts the feminine within him, and it is at this moment that betrayal loses its power. Because upon rediscovering his own sensitivity, he no longer needs to seek it in another body. Love becomes presence again, not escape, and what was once impulse becomes awareness. The man who rediscovers his anima rediscovers the language of the soul, the silence that communicates, the gaze that welcomes, the touch that heals. He no longer betrays because he no longer needs to prove anything. The emotion that once destabilized him now sustains him. And the woman by his side ceases to be a mirror of neediness and becomes a companion of wholeness. Desire transforms into communion and instinct into wisdom. What was a search becomes an encounter, and what was betrayal becomes reconciliation with one's own essence. There is an inevitable moment when a man finds himself facing his own mirror. Not the mirror of the body, but that of the soul. The one that reflects what he has tried to deny all his life. After each impulse, each lie, each justification, emptiness arises. An emptiness that is not absence, but a painful presence. It is the echo of conscience calling back what has been repressed. Jung said that the unconscious always exacts its price, and that price is confrontation. The man who has lived divided between desire and guilt, between pleasure and denial, reaches a point where there is no longer any possible escape. He feels that something within him is watching him, and this inner gaze is the beginning of transformation. In the first moments, he tries to deceive himself. He believes he can regain control, that all he needs to do is distance himself from temptation, delete messages, change habits. But the more he tries to control, the more he realizes that the root of what dominates him is not outside, but inside. The betrayal now shows its true face. It was not a moral error, but a psychological symptom. The man begins to realize that he has repeated the same cycle countless times, only with different faces. The feeling of euphoria, the secret, the fear, the guilt, everything returns like a familiar score. He is both the author and prisoner of this melody. And it is at this moment that the question arises that breaks down his resistance. Until when? Tension intensifies when pleasure ceases to function as anesthesia. What once brought him excitement now provokes anguish. The body reacts, but the soul refuses. He tries to relive the sensation, but something has changed. The unconscious has already revealed too much. The betrayal, which seemed like an escape valve, is now a distorted mirror, forcing him to look at what he doesn't want to see. And what he sees is not a strong man, but someone lost, fragmented, exhausted of himself. At this point, many crumble. It's what Jung called the collapse of the persona, when the mask falls and the true face is revealed. Amidst this silent ruin, something unexpected happens. The man begins to feel compassion for himself. Not the compassion of self-defense, but that of recognition. He understands that he betrayed not because he was evil, but because he was unconscious. That he sought love in the wrong places because he never learned to love himself fully. It is a revelation that does not bring immediate relief, but awakens lucidity. Pleasure loses its luster, and desire now demands meaning. He wants to feel, but he wants to feel truthfully. And it is in this space, between pain and understanding, that the first trace of healing is born. But the unconscious is wise. Before freeing it, it puts it through one last test, the return of the impulse. Like a shadow that refuses to die, desire returns, disguised, seductive, promising. It feels the temptation to repeat the cycle, and it is at this moment that destiny is decided. Jung believed that man only evolves when he realizes that what pursues him is not an enemy, but a part of himself. The impulse does not need to be eliminated, it needs to be understood. When man recognizes that desire is not a call for destruction, but for integration, the shadow loses control, and pleasure is reunited with consciousness. This moment is one of tension and liberation. He no longer feels guilt, but responsibility. He knows that desire will continue to exist, but now he observes it head-on, without fear. Pleasure ceases to be an escape and becomes a choice. Infidelity, seen through this new lens, reveals itself as the symptom of a soul that was trying to heal itself. And when the man finally understands this, he realizes that true adultery was never against his partner, but against his own self, the divine and whole part that he abandoned. The silence that follows is different. It's not emptiness, it's presence. There's a serenity that doesn't come from repression, but from awareness. The man who once betrayed now looks at desire and sees in it a mirror, not a trap. He no longer needs to prove anything, because he has found what he always sought: meaning. And it is at this point, when pleasure and guilt finally dissolve, that the path to inner reconciliation opens. Because what was once a cycle of escape transforms into a journey of return. A return to the center, to the soul, to wholeness. And it is this return that prepares him for the final step, the definitive encounter with his own conscience. There comes a point when a man understands that what he called destiny was always merely a reflection of his own unconscious choices. The repetitions, the guilt, the emptiness, the lies. Everything was a silent dialogue between him and his own shadow. When Jung spoke of individuation, he was referring precisely to this process. The moment when the human being stops running from himself and begins to walk towards his own totality. It is the point where the betrayer and the betrayed, the guilty and the repentant, the weak and the strong meet and realize that they were always the same person. Betrayal ceases to be an isolated act and reveals itself as a symbol, the mirror that showed what he still needed to heal. In this new state of consciousness, man no longer seeks to erase the past, but to understand it. He looks at each mistake and sees a sign. Each choice was an attempt, often clumsy, to find meaning. And, paradoxically, it is in accepting his imperfection that he finds strength. Fidelity, once imposed as an external morality, now arises as a natural consequence of wholeness. The man faithful to himself does not need to betray anyone because he no longer feels divided. Integration does not make him immune to desire, but it makes him lucid in the face of it. Impulse ceases to command and begins to dialogue with conscience. Life, once driven by excesses, begins to flow with balance. But this transition is not simple. It requires courage to sustain one's own silence, to listen to the inner voices without hiding behind distractions. Jung said that the soul whispers first, and when it is not heard, it screams. The man who has learned to listen to this whisper discovers that desire is not the enemy of consciousness, it is its messenger. What once seemed like sin now reveals itself as symbolic language. The body speaks when the soul cannot find words. Looking outward was merely a plea to return inward. When he understands this, desire loses its power of destruction and gains that of revelation. And, for the first time, he experiences a freedom that does not depend on what is outside, but on the peace that is born within. The transformation that begins at this point is silent, but profound. The man begins to see relationships not as fields of control, but as mirrors. He learns that the other does not exist to complete him, but to reveal him. Each encounter, each conflict, each loss brings to light an aspect of himself. The woman now is no longer a symbol of what he lacks, but a witness to what awakens in him. Love ceases to be possession and becomes exchange. Pleasure transforms into communion. Touch, once a search for anesthesia, becomes an expression of a reconciled soul. He understands finally that it is not about being perfect, but whole. And it is in this wholeness that fidelity finds meaning, not as imprisonment, but as conscious freedom. At the end of this journey, one inevitable question remains. What does it truly mean to be a man? For Jung, being a man is embracing paradox, uniting strength and tenderness, reason and feeling, light and shadow. It is recognizing that within each person there are multiple voices, and that maturity is not about silencing them, but about orchestrating them. The man who understands this no longer fears his own instinct. He transforms it into wisdom. He is not ashamed of the past, because he understands that it was through his falls that he found himself. Infidelity, then, dissolves in time like an old symbol, important for learning, but useless after the lesson. And you, who have made it this far, perhaps realize that this video isn't just about men who cheat, but about all of us. About the constant struggle between what we show and what we hide. Because everyone, at some point, betrays something within themselves, an ideal, a dream, a truth. And the way back is always the same, looking inward with honesty and courage. The first step is simple but transformative. Stop judging yourself and start understanding yourself. If this reflection touched you deeply, take a moment to breathe. Allow yourself to be silent and perceive what your subconscious is trying to tell you. Share in the comments, even anonymously, what resonated most with your soul. This space is a collective mirror, a place where what is said helps others to recognize themselves. Like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. That way, you continue walking with us on this journey of self-knowledge, reconciliation, and awareness, where each step inward is also a step towards freedom.